So I think what we're going to do is just try and have some questions immediately to Joe and Terry, and then we're going to sort of break out into more general discussion after that. So has someone got something they'd like to raise in response to what we've just heard? I've got one thing which I suppose the things that I've taken away from me are from these two. Just two things would be: what would it mean to conceive of shaping a research methodology as game design? This seems to be something that I could go with, take somewhere. And from what Joe was just saying, what would it mean to treat a social milieu as a composition? How might that shift a relationship to what we might call research subjects or participants? Thinking of that as something, or a composed situation.
You just add into design, because I mean, very much the idea of the game, but also supposed to sort of share with you that we do that in research. We do make games because it's one of the ways to allow sort of heterogeneity or spontaneity into what we call data collection. But we do, for instance, we might turn it into a game so that we as the researcher disappear somehow, so the game carries. So you can put in structure like your words, and we do something very similar. Put in words or put little prompts but create a game structure which is loose enough for the game to happen. And also we have interesting ideas about comparability and non-comparability. So you might want to use the same kind of game but do it in all sorts of different places and see the different things that might happen, and then be interested in talking across those differences. So in a sense, we came to the same solution, which is interesting. And I just thought also about I really liked one of the things that's been really interesting today is like the mobility of the researcher, the different ways in which the researcher can be imagined. And I like the idea that we're talking about the writer and the artist in residence, but we're talking about the academic in residence here. The researcher as the one who's in residence. And I think it's like, oh, of course, of course it should be flexible that way round. And then to ask, what would you want of me? And we can think about, I was just thinking in some ways about your Abergavenny or some of the research you've been doing, Valerie, that you're kind of offering yourself to communities and saying, what would you want of me? How could I work with you? Which is so different than the normal way that we set it up, which is you are value, because we've got our system of value as well, and I think it's really important to keep that in. So data is value. That's it's a way of extracting value, and communities become value, and ways of gaining that for the academy in some ways. So I thought that was a real breath of fresh air, just to think that we could. The researcher is a mobile subject and can play a different part in the game themselves. So it was really, both of your presentations were really interesting to think back into the ways that I work for certain folks.
I only got sort of two just barely anecdotal responses to this. It's the social milieu as composition. One has to do with one of the stated aims of that 3-year project about being about tragedy, as if what tragedy might be about is a certain gathering of the community, whatever the hell that is, around an event or a problem. As if that could be done in our contemporary moment, and that's not likely, is it? And there was something about it, about the project, of putting that to the test. But one of the ways in which it sort of worked accidentally was there was a little band of us who turned up at all these shows over 3 years. And, it's like, I'll see you in Bergen. There was something of that, yeah? And people would be writing their pieces. There'd be a certain sense as well of competitiveness, yeah? Which I think a lot of people enjoyed, of a competitiveness of generating things to say out of this thing which offered itself to the production of discourse, to the production of thought beyond itself. It was never about working out what that theatre was about. That theatre was always like an image offered to whoever sees it to now do something with it. And I was saying about the little band of fools with their notebooks and their publications, which I start thinking of that was the composed social milieu that struck me at that time.
But there was no official scribe. There could be multiple scribes.
Yeah.
In essence, yeah. That's what. Yeah. That's it.
I want to ask a question to both of you, and you, Valerie, as well, with your idea about drawings and theory. About how blank a slate are you? How tabula rasa are you as you go to those situations? Or do you go with ideas that you want to refine, develop, work with? And do they become more sophisticated, more developed as you go from show to show? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just talk as part of forced entertainment first. I think because we have worked together for such a long time, that to some extent, it's a bit like the blind dog who waits 13 years for his time to walk on stage. There are things in the cupboard, as it were, that you've forgotten about, and you don't walk into the room thinking, "Oh, now's the time for the blind dog." But somehow a combination of talking to one another and trying things allows things from the past to come back in as kind of motifs or tricks or things that you want to pick up again. But having said that, we don't. I think we normally the first working day we sit around on the floor and drink lots of coffee and moan a lot about how we haven't got any ideas, and it feels like it's blank. It feels like it's empty because we never really start from wanting to present a story or an argument or a thesis of any kind. We want to kind of slowly build up a situation every time we make a piece of work. So it doesn't actually, the work doesn't really progress in a straightforward way. It feels like it disappears for whole weeks where people are just stuck, and we throw 70% of what we've got out and say it's rubbish and start again.
It's a great question, and I'd say the tabula rasa, no, never at all. There's always sort of agendas at stake and sort of projections. I think, let's see, I've got some sense of what might happen. But what I did, it speaks to the experience. What I did enjoy about that time of doing work at this company was, as far as the theatre can go, it did take me by surprise. And it did, that the situation of working where Claudia Castellucci says, "Great guys, can we have text in the next 3 days because it's going to be sent to translators?" Like, something has to be produced and sent. And I'm feeling that I've got no idea. And that's, as we get on, that becomes rarer and rarer, I find, in the theatre. I go and see the theatre, I know what I'm going to see. It's rare that you suddenly go, "What the hell was that?" And it got as close as the theatre can to that experience where you felt almost like somebody who's blank. I now have to just almost invent, but inventing is never ab ovo. It's always a rhetorical machine, the structures which you bring into play. But it speaks to the nature of the effect, that question. Yeah.
I think because, I'm now in contact with this world of performance. It's completely striking for me now as well. But as I understood, it's something about the script being written after the performance. That's completely new idea for me. And the idea also that, could we say that in some way the performance finds its place in the academic essay in some way? So in some way it gets a kind of normative form through the academic writing. So it would be a bit more radical if you didn't write and let it be like that. You kind of gather the fragments into a scrap. So what's the role of the academic?
Again, makes complete sense. Briefly, because I remember an argument between the two directors, as it were, then saying, "Could our work ever be restaged by another company?" And Romeo saying, "No," and Chiara was saying, "Yes." It was like, "No, yes, no, yes." It was like Punch and Judy thing. Her basic line on this was that a work is devised and assembled, but then when somebody goes and speaks to somebody else, and they say, "What did you see?" And you say, "I saw this." What's happening then is the reconstruction of the dramaturgy. And the dramaturgy only comes into existence when somebody says, "This is what happened to me." Yeah? It might not be "this is what I saw," it might be "this is what happened to me." But that in itself is a dramaturgy. On one hopes that the only home for thought is not academic essays, as we're all doomed. Yeah, but as soon as this company's become more famous, there's been more academic essays about them. I'm sure that's the case for Force Entertainment as well. So I mean, one of the things that theatre studies people like us would take on would be the question which actually Richard was talking about in the Q&A, which you start considering your language. Yeah, I mean, I could say more about things that interest me, about what to do with sentences and narrative and image in writing about art, but you start considering your language, I think, because that would be deathly. Yeah.
So it's a kind of a risky thing for the performance. I mean, the role of the essay.
Yeah. I know risk was part of the discourse around Force Entertainment for a while. I have problems with risk being talked about. It's like, what do we really mean by risk? What are we really risking? Yeah. It's yeah.
Did you have a question there?
Well, yeah, more kind of an inherent comment following the last conversation, because I'd just been thinking before that about the question of archiving and qualitative data, I suppose, which hasn't kind of come up, and I suppose we've been talking about kind of, practice approaches and thinking about that in terms of research. So I suppose I had been going to ask, what does it mean to think about kind of what are the issues in qualitative longitudinal research, which is often the case of, that data is often archived to be made available to other people to reuse in some way. Not always, but kind of often it is controversial in different ways, I suppose. So I was going to ask in a way, what does kind of performance or practice have to say about the afterlife stuff? But I think this conversation's just been a little bit about that. And then just to kind of throw in as well there, I was also thinking about Valerie's presentation this morning about loss and transmission, and I was actually thinking about that loss and transmission in relation then to how kind of a lot of academic social science researchers feel about the archiving of transcripts and what loss is there, and what's at stake in transmission, what is being transmitted or allowed to be transmitted or not transmitted. So yeah.
Do you want to respond?
I've got thoughts about that. For me, the most interesting stuff recently I've been reading in theatre studies has kind of been about this. It's been people doing theatre history again, but theatre history on the recent contemporary. Yeah, the stuff which is just out of memory. I've got a PhD student who's working on early 80s Italian theatre, like stuff made when she was being born. I examined a super PhD about sort of 1970s Polish theatre, and there's some really interesting thought about the afterlife. One of the lines of thought which goes with this is: can the theatre which is now gone still have its effect? If you will, can it still function as theatre, rather than just be historical object or data to be written about? Because if there's anything worth writing about it, would go certain arguments, it's all about the aesthetic. Yeah? And if you want to talk about cultural politics, etc., the interesting stuff is in the aesthetic. It is in issues of how encounter works, how effect works, how it circulates. So what is the sort of historical work that can be done with the afterlife of a performance in that respect? There's a lot of people doing interesting practical things with this. For example, this company I've been talking about document their work. They made a video. You can buy it in a free DVD set of the piece I was talking about. But it's structured not as a documentary record, but as a video memory. So what they've tried to capture, they commissioned. There was myself and another guy writing essays. And there's these two other guys who were making this video throughout this project. It sort of tries to capture what it would be for the imagination of a spectator who's in and amongst it, and not just in the audience, but if you will, on the stage. They re-edit it. They betray the dramaturgical structure for the sake of a remembering. Things like this.
I think as well, I mean, for some time now there's been a a lot of work around a kind of oral history approach to collecting experience of theatre, which actually throws the narrative of the experience back to the audience member, not necessarily the academic. I think that's a really kind of interesting way of documenting a piece. And for some forms of live art, the most valuable form, where you can't get a camera in, where people are watching things in maybe one-to-one in unusual spaces, then, as Joe has already said, what people say conversationally about the experience they have becomes the truest kind of and the most valuable kind of record.
Can I just add in something about archive also? I mean, just going back to our own theatre days, all of the seminal work that I saw, I didn't see, I missed, basically. So whether it was Tadeusz Kantor, it was the Worcester Group, it was Pina Bausch, all of those shows I never saw. What I saw was photographs of shows that I knew I'd already missed, and there was something totally fascinating about those odd few photographs left of those shows that sort of signalled towards an experience that couldn't be had. We don't know what it would have been like. If I had had it, I would have missed it anyway from Joe's perspective. So all of those ideas about missed encounter and whatever as absolutely formative, I think are part of an idea about archives that the theatre just highlights because it's so obvious you've missed the show. But in other ways, when you're collecting, I mean, I don't collect data, I don't really know what data is, but I do constantly work on ideas about missed encounters that are, I think the theatre just shows up something that I imagine that you're all dealing with all the time. Actually, whether that's around the ways that participants recount things, or whether the research encounter itself is always already missed, at some level, that you got there too late, you're left with the debris, the leftover bits, the stuff that's sort of already worked through, and you're just picking through the bones, really, of the experience. And there are lots of figures of that kind of research, aren't there, sort of rag and bone man type figures.
I think as well there have been artists who've deliberately chosen to document their way in a way that is entirely deliberately fragmented in order to create that kind of gap that leaves space for the viewer to imagine and to engage in their own way, in a really subjective way. I think that's really exciting. I mean, a lot of people will actually prefer photographic evidence of theatrical representation rather than video.
Well, I think there's an interesting thing that's come up sort of again and again over the course of the day. I was thinking about, Jennifer's infant observation notes, that careful description, the way in which that can reanimate or possibly animate in a way that it wasn't even, give more. And you're talking about when you're describing your notes, I mean, that's exactly how we would work as ethnographers, sort of, with a heart, not, in there, and somehow that hand is working, and then you go back and you write them, and then something happens with the imagination. I think it's really interesting, what is it that happens? And this is one of, if we're talking about, there being a controversy in social sciences about archiving and ownership of data, one of the key areas where there's a controversy is on that kind of text. Does that text belong to anybody? Is it just a record? Because when we say data, at some level we're saying there's no authorship. We're saying it's just a record. It's just a record of something. No, it shouldn't belong to anybody. And these texts aren't, they have life in them at some level. So I suppose it's these discussions about what that means. And I mean, ownership is a sort of legal thing, but there's also sort of a moral and a sort of metaphysical aspect to it as well, about what is the life that's in them, and what are the consequences of it.
I mean, just picking up on the TAVI infant observation thing, I mean, I did another course at the TAVI, which is a different course, but it's about observation of organisations. And one thing I really recall from that, the sort of method that was we had to strictly adhere to, is that one had to go into an organisation to observe over a period of 3 to 6 months. But you weren't allowed to do any form of documentation or recording in the event. You just had to be there. And then you had to basically reconstruct from your imagination what had happened. And when I started doing it, I would literally rush out the door into the nearest cafe and just try to regurgitate my brain onto the page for the hour that I'd been in there. And then after a while, it's like, that isn't going to work as a sort of method. And so I would just do the observation, and then maybe a week later, I'd start thinking about it. It's like, that is so then I'm really basically in a situation of imaginative reenactment of what I fantasized happened. Yeah.
That's the same in an analytic session. You don't take notes while you're while you're analysing somebody. But I've been recently working with someone on the telephone who's away at the moment, and there's something very odd that then happens when you're working with someone therapeutically on the telephone, so you can take notes for the first time. And my supervisor came down on me like a ton of bricks. I bought these notes. She said, what are these notes? I've never seen you take notes like this before. They were completely verbatim. It's like everything she said and I said, I just wrote down as it was happening. She was like, what are you doing? You go sit in your chair that you sit in always for your analytic session. You don't take notes during analysis. What were you thinking? You know, the note taking, the creation of the scene has to happen after that time gap, and that's exactly. I mean, that's a really interesting and important.
But I'm thinking now how that say that's difficult. A research or a certain part of our professional practice relates to other parts of our professional practice. So, I mean, just as regular academic now, or as head of department, I find I've got so much on that if I don't note down and send emails to myself, then I just lose it. And examples keep coming up. You know, a colleague could well be Simon. Actually, he was a couple of days ago. Right? Says, Joe, you promised X, and I think, yeah. Meanwhile, another form of thought, which might be the things that we care to think about in a different sort of way, we don't take notes, so that it can circle with a different sort of temporality in our thinking.
Yeah.
It can kind of come to mind when we ask it to, or need it to, maybe.
Yeah.
For me, that really chimes with a kind of something that we used to be much more strict about in our creative practice, which was when we had more time, all of us, and we were combining bits of being paid with bits of being on the dole or whatever, then we would deliberately construct a working process where we worked for a month and then left it alone for a couple of months and saw what stayed when we came back 2 months later. And we sort of regarded that as a kind of a really good filter. And actually, you know, the thing that you might think that you liked at the end of that month is not the thing that you're coming back to 2 months later when you've just allowed yourself to forget about it and return to it.
Those were the days.
Yes.
Can I just say, I've just found that exchange really fascinating, having come from conducting a year-long ethnography within a primary school, and realising very, very early on the sort of notion that you'd be in that sort of environment and you didn't have any expectation of writing whilst you were there in that type of highly physically charged, doing environment. And that sort of sense of, for a long time, feeling very guilty that then it may be in cycling away from it, that I then have to think, now I've got to stop and write that down. Then worrying about the sort of the effect, well, that's some time, or since I saw that scene, or then having a recreation of that scene, as you've just said, in a different temporality. But the way you talked about it was much more exciting than that sense of rather heavy-laden social scientific guilt of what does it mean not to have written it at the time. So that really engenders an excitement into that notion of what really happened. So that's all.
I just made the observation that positivism casts its long shadow.
Yeah,
And the assumption that somehow through using a tape recorder or a video or writing something down, we are in a position to collect facts and truths that we can somehow use and challenge. I think the way that you're describing the plasticity of the material that we have available to us, the way that we bring evidence and ideas into play with each other all the time and doing our research and our interpretation and our exploration of that are important features that we have to bear in mind. And commonality, I think, across our different research endeavours.
I'm just thinking of there's a piece of work we did recently where we deliberately threw away all recording devices except for a camera, and we very much negotiated for taking the pictures. And it was incredibly liberating, both deliberately not to create something for an archive, so that was sort of a resistant, rebellious act in the face of the demands on us to make our data available immediately for other markets, but also just to see how would it be different, to sort of the sense of the tools becoming so dominant, actually, the recording tools, being quite hard to escape. So what would happen if we let go of them? What would happen to us? Would we freak out? Would we know anything? Would we notice or see anything? And we needed to do that for ourselves to see whether we could still do it.
Did you freak out?
No, it was fantastic. But it was wonderful having pictures as provocation. So we did these kind of microethnographies where we spent the day with someone using the idea of work shadowing, asking them, we were looking at motherings, we were asking, what is your mothering, what's happening now? And we would agree with the mothers moments to take photographs of things. We'd say, and that would be the one form of recording. So because photographs come with the time on them, it's kind of, they're kind of indexical accounts of a particular moment, then they were what we wrote around subsequently. So there wasn't the panic of just the blank slate. We had these images, but to write to. But yeah, no, it was very good.
Rachel, well, the time is 5:02. Did you want some time at the end to talk about the next?
Well, I don't really think so. I think people kind of I identified the kind of ongoing things that are happening, and people are just very welcome to be in touch by email and or informal conversations, or come for something to eat.
Yeah.
To continue them, but I don't think so. We've got a session tomorrow, workshops tomorrow, and all those people know what they're doing. So I don't think we do.
Okay. But I just really like to really warmly and with huge gratitude thank everyone that's taken part today. It's been absolutely fantastic, and there would be no day without you. So thank you very, very much.